Greetings! In this video we will create a 2x2 brick end plate and a 2x4 brick end plate. Let's get started. We'll begin by importing your peg start file. So we'll come to File, Import, and a quick word here, I'm going to import it just with the default settings. So there is my pegstart.ma. I'll hit import. And if you take a look over in the outliner, you'll see that the scene file name is also associated with that. That will make for a messy outliner as we begin to import projects into one another. So I'm actually going to delete that, and we'll come and we'll import this a second time. File, Import, and if you look on the right hand side of the import dialog box, and we'll slide down to the bottom, choose Merge into Selected Namespace. Now when we choose Peg Start and we hit Import, you can see in the outliner that the scene file name is not associated with it. And so just remember that when you're importing, File, Import, and we can do it in the dialog box, come down to the bottom and choose Merge into Selected Namespace. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild this just for review, and we'll go through this kind of quickly. But we start with a poly cylinder. I'll hit the F key to get in there nice and tight. We'll open the inputs. You'll recall that our subdivisions are 8. Our height was 0.8. We look in the side view, you can see that it's sitting in the middle of the ground plane. So on the translate Y, we'll raise that up 0.4. Subdivisions 8, height 0.8, translate Y 0.4. Click on the panel, tap, and we'll come into the perspective view. Right click, choose face, and we're going to delete the bottom faces of this cylinder. Good idea to hit the 4 key, make sure you didn't get anything selected on the other side. If you had, you can hold down the control key and draw a bounding box around what you'd like to deselect. I'll hit the 5 key so we can see this in shaded, and we'll hit the delete key. And so the bottom of this cylinder, which we're calling a peg, is now open. We'll right click, we'll double click the bottom edge. So I right clicked and chose edge. Double click that bottom edge that you can see here. We'll come into the modeling toolkit, we'll hit extrude, and let's look at this in the top view. We're going to pull this out in the translate Z, and just so we're starting together, let's say 0.5. We're going to pull the vertices out on and form a grid snapped square, and that is our starting point peg. We'll right click and we'll choose vertex, and you'll recall that when I'll also select the move tool. When we're snapping, we don't want to pull the item we're snapping. We want to click on what we're snapping to. Reason being is as you come and click here, you might accidentally hit one of the arrows. Now I'm constrained. If I was to try to snap to this grid here, you can see that I can't because I'm constrained on the X. To get back to regular, right, we can click in the middle, and now we see the red X and the blue Z. And now when we grid snap, we can grid snap in both axis directions. So just advice, hold down the X key, middle mouse button, and click on what you'd like to snap to rather than dragging, just so that you don't activate one of the constrain arrows. And so we've grid snapped that all the way around. I'll hit the Q key, right click, object mode, and we'll jump back into the perspective view. And of course, 5 key for shade, and then the 3 key is the preview for the subdivide. So here we'd like the top and bottom edge here to remain hard. So we'll bevel, which will double the edge loops around. We'll right click, choose edge, double click that top edge, and we can do these together. We'll shift double click. I'll dolly around just so you can see those edge loops. 5 key, and then we'll hit bevel. Bevel, and for all of these bricks and plates, our fraction is 0.2, and our segments are 2. And then once again, I'm going to manually come over and just click on the select tool to get out of that. If I'd hit Q, because I was inputting fields, it would take the Q. I could have clicked on the panel and then hit the Q. Or just a reminder, you can manually select there to get out of the tool that you're using. When you're using these modeling toolkit tools, once you're done, you want to immediately hit the Q key or manually select just to get out from using that tool. Now when we hit the 3 key, we can see that we have the peg that we were after there. And before we save this one out, let's put the pivot at the bottom. So we'll right click to object mode. I'm in the side view currently, and we can see the Z and the Y. And you'll recall that changing the pivot point is a matter of tapping the D key. And we'll raise this. Now in this instance, we do want to constrain ourselves on the Y. And I've got two options here. I can grid snap because I happen to have a grid here, so I can hold down the X key, middle mouse button, snap that, and then tap the D key. Let me do that a second time. Let's move that back up to where it was. We're on the Y constraint. I could have also held down the V key and middle mouse button, snap that to the bottom. Tap the D key when we're done. We want to get in there nice and tight just to verify that it's on the very bottom of the shape. And the reason that we did that is so that we can grid snap this in the perspective view. If that pivot was in the middle, when we went to grid snap, it would shift the geometry down. So with the pivot point at the bottom, we're free to grid snap in the perspective view. We don't have to limit ourselves to the orthographic views. Now, you want to save this if you already hadn't. File, and you can say export selection, call that peg start. Or you could save this scene, of course, and then just start a new scene and re-import, or a new scene and save scene as. But you want to have that peg start so that you can just start from this position in these upcoming brick and plate lessons. All right, let's create our 2x2. And once again, we've got that pivot at the bottom. So I'm going to grid snap this to this quadrant here. So right, I'm in this quadrant. And we'll come up to Edit, Duplicate. And then we can just grid snap this over, right? Make sure. We'll duplicate. You can use the keyboard command, but I'll just do it the long way so you can see. Edit, Duplicate. We'll grid snap this 4 units, and then our fourth and final. We'll hit duplicate, and we'll grid snap this over. Now if I select all these, and I'm going to go ahead and hide the grid here now that we're done using it. And if I hit the 3 key, right, you can see these are separate shapes. I'll come back to one. They're all selected in the object mode. And we're going to come to the modeling toolkit and hit combine. Now you'll recall that the vertices that are sitting on top of each other, they weren't merged or welded. This is now a singular shape. And I'm going to turn on my wireframe on shaded here just to make that a little bit easier to see. We've got a singular shape, but there are gaps. And there are times when that's desirable. But we want to merge or weld all of these overlapping vertices here. So I'm going to hit 1. I'm also going to delete my history at this point. You can see the transform nodes for those 4 original polys are still there. So we'll come up to Edit, Delete All by Type. At this point, because there's nothing else in the scene, we can use the global function all, delete all by type history. We got rid of those transform nodes, and we're left with what it's named polycylinder 5. And once again, if we hit the 3 key, we can see that it is indeed singular, but there are gaps. So we'll right-click, choose vertex. We'll draw a bounding box around everything. And even though we don't want these others merged, the threshold by default, if we come to Edit Mesh, Merge, and we open the dialog box, is 0.01. So that means that it's essentially only those vertices that are overlapping that will be merged. These that are very close, they won't be. So we'll hit Merge, and you can verify this now. If I come and grab one of these vertices and we pull it, we see those 2 are now singular. If we hit the 3 key, we can see that those overlapping on the borders are now merged, and we're ready to proceed. Now, because we want to make a brick and a plate, you could export this at this point. We could come to File, Export, and we could call this 2x2 beginning or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and just make a duplicate, and we'll review making bricks and plates and just the difference there. And we'll put this second one on a layer. So I've got it selected as an object. I just slid it over in the positive X direction. And we'll create a layer, this icon here, with that selected. And now it's associated with that. And we can just tap the V key to make that invisible. So I can bring that back when I'm ready to make the plate. And we'll continue here and we'll make our brick. You'll recall from the previous lessons that we would double click the outer edge. I'm going to hit the Q key. And just 4 keys so you can see we double click that outer edge. And we'll come to the modeling toolkit and we'll hit extrude. And this is in the negative Z direction, and it was negative 4.8. So negative 4.8, that is the length of our brick. On the layer that we just hit away when we're creating the plate, recall that it would be negative 1.6, 1/3 the height of the standard. We'll come underneath here, and we want to close this off. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Q key, and we'll come to Mesh, Fill Hole, Mesh, Fill Hole. And then if we hit the 3 key at this point, you can see that we've got an end gun, we've got a multi-sided face. And so we'll come back to 1, and then we'll just finish this with the multi-cut. Just going to click drag and click drag. And I'll do it this way just to make it maybe a little bit easier to see. So click drag and enter, click drag, enter, click drag, missed it there, enter, and then click drag, enter. There are a couple of different ways we could have handled this, but I think this is ultimately easier. It means fewer steps in the next section here, because we can just pick these faces. I'm going to select this face, shift double click, shift click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click. Hit the 4 key, make sure we didn't get anything on the other side. If we had, control key bounding box to deselect. But with these faces selected, we can hit extrude, and I'm going to come to the 5 key. We'll hit extrude, and you'll recall that our offset is 0.8. We'll go ahead and manually type that in. On the offset, 0.8. And we're going to extrude a second time. If you clicked off or you were opening the scene and starting from this particular point, you'd have to reselect those faces there. But we have them selected, so we'll extrude the second time. We'll hit extrude. And then it's our local Z, and we're going -4. -4. And so that is the dimension. If we look at it in the side view, I'll hit the 4 key. And so we can see that it's the standard space around, that 0.8 distance. And that's what it should look like in the side view. I'll right click to object mode and click off. Now you'll recall that if we hit the 3 key, right, we see that that's soft there. And so we need to bevel the edges. And this is not a technical challenge, it's more of a visual challenge, making sure that you've selected all of the proper edges. And if you miss one or you accidentally select one that you shouldn't have, just undo. You could save at this point and reopen. Always a good idea to increment and save at every successful plateau. So I would recommend saving here. But I'm going to go 1, and let's make those edge selections so that we can bevel them so that when we subdivide, the edges remain hard. We'll right click, and we have to do this 4 times on this top because we have these intersections here. So I've got the top square, the topmost square. I had to shift click to get around. We'll shift double click, we've got the bottom square. We'll shift double click, we've got the interior bottom square. And then we'll shift double click this bottom interior, and we'll have to do this 4 times just like the top. Shift double click, shift double click. So we have a total of 4 squares. Let's look at it from the top. So you can see the outer top, the outer bottom, the inner bottom, and then the inner recess. Maybe that's an easier view there. So take a look at that, make sure you've got that selection, and now we'll come and we'll do the corners. I'll hit the 5 key. So I'm just shift selecting this corner, 3rd corner, missed it, try one more time, and our 4th corner. Hit the 4 key, make sure I didn't accidentally select something else. We'll come to the bottom and we need the diagonals. So we'll shift click this diagonal, shift click the 2nd, shift click the 3rd, shift click the 4th. I don't want to double click, because that would run up and then it would select this edge all the way to this point, and we don't want any edges selected on our pegs. We'll come and the interior corner 1, interior corner 2, interior corner 3, interior corner 4. So those are all of the edges, the 4 squares, the diagonals on the bottom, the interior corners, and the exterior corners. Take a 4 key and I'll dolly around that slowly and just make sure that you've got that selection. And it's not a problem if you don't. You can just undo or reopen and practice making that selection. I'll hit the 5 key and we'll come out to Bevel, and we'll recall once again that the fraction is 0.2 and the segments are 2. We'll right click and choose Object, click off, and we can hit the 3 key now in object mode, and you want to dolly around and just make sure that that looks right. And remember, our overarching goal is to make sure that everything is 4-sided. We've got some tries on the top, but once we subdivide this, those will be quads on the top as well. So here is the actual shape, and you'll want to save this. Definitely save this version. When we're using dynamics later on, it's better to use a simple version that hasn't been subdivided. And we can use the preview in Arnold to make that render look good. But this would be much less weight on the processor when we engage in dynamics. But once you've saved that out, you could then come to Mesh Smooth, and there is what we'll be using for our brick builds there. Now I'm going to come to the channel box, and this would just be a very quick review. We could bring, the one that we'd saved away. Let's go ahead and put this guy on a layer. And, I was mentioning saving there. We should delete all the history. That just makes it cleaner. So with that 2x2 selected, I'm going to come to Edit, Delete by Type History. And this is the one that you could save. I'm going to put it on a layer. I have it selected. I've created a new layer, layer 2, and I'll just hit the V. And let's put this one back, and we'll quickly create a plate. I say quickly just because it's the exact same workflow. And you could even skip to the next section if you understand this, but you should be able to do it from scratch. And so maybe good review just to watch, even if you already understand it. With that edge selection selected, we'll hit Extrude. And remember that it is -1.6. -1.6. And then with that selected, we'll come up to Mesh Fill Hole. And once again, we want to multi-cut across. And we can just breeze through this, return when we're done, click, drag, return, click, drag, return. 2 more. And our final one, click, drag, return. Now we'll grab the bottom faces. So I've selected face, shift double click, shift click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click. Hit the 4 key to make sure nothing is on the other side. And then we'll come and we'll hit extrude, and you'll recall that our offset is 0.8. And then let's hit the 5 key just so you can see that. And again, if you clicked off, you'd have to remake that selection. But while we have it already selected, we're going to extrude a second time. And then this is a different, also a difference. With the full-size brick, we went up -0.4. Here we're going to say -0.8. Oops, and I put that on the offset. It is the translate Z. So let's get that back to 0. Sorry about that. Wrong field. Click in the local translate Z, and this is -0.8. And that is the interior recess, and we'll hit the Q key, right click to object mode, and let's look at this in the side view, and you can see there is that 0.8. So there's the 0.8 recess, and we have an equal distance around for our plate. And then same thing, real quick, we'll double click that edge. I'm going to hide my grid just to make the visual a little bit better. We shift clicked 4 times. We'll get the shift double click to get that bottom square, shift double click square interior. We'll have to do 4 on the interior recess, and I missed that one. Let's make sure we've got it there. And I'm going to hit the 4 key just to be able to see a little bit better. And we're getting those edges all the way around. We'll hit the 5 key, so we've got the interior recess. We've got the bottom interior, the bottom exterior, and then the top, all the way around. Now we want to do the corners, so we'll right click, shift click 1, shift click 2, shift click 3, shift click 4. I don't want to double click because that would run up onto my peg. We've got our diagonals here, and then our, missed that one, our interior corners, and I missed it again. Our interior corners here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll hit the 4 key, and I'll dolly around, and I know it is a challenge to see that, but you're picking all the squares and all the corners. And if you miss one or misselect something, just undo or reopen. And we will hit bevel, and our fraction is 0.2, and our segments are 2. We'll click on the panel, hit the Q key, and then we can hit the 5 key. And we'll dolly around just to check, and that looks right. It's 4 sides all the way around. We can hit the 3 key as a preview. You definitely want to save this. As I mentioned, when we're using dynamics, we'll use these zero subdivide. There's no subdivision has taken place. But once you've saved that out or exported that, right, we can come to File, Export Selection with this selected as an object. 2x2 plate, put sub D0. That would be a good designation for this. And then I'll go ahead and say Mesh Smooth, and we'll come back to the channel box, and so that this isn't in the way, we'll move it over. And there are our 2x2 brick and plate. Now, we probably want our pivot at the bottom. Also, I can see here I have lots of history. So at this point, we'll go ahead and say delete all by type history. We'll jump into the, let's say the front view. I'll turn on my wireframe. And let's just put the pivot at the bottom for both of these. We know that we tap the D key, and we'll make the Y translate active. And in this case, I didn't put it on a grid. I could have put it on a grid so that I could snap, but it's easy enough to hold down the V key and just middle mouse button click. Now the danger is that there are, right, very close here, and I actually missed it. We want it to be on that one there at the very bottom. We'll tap the D key. Now that we've got it at the bottom, we can grid snap it up onto the ground plane. And we'll do the same here. We'll tap the D key, and I don't have any grid to snap to. I could get it in the proximity, zoom in here, and then again, V key, middle mouse button, make sure it's at the very bottom, tap the D key to get out of that, and now we could grid snap this up, and we've got our brick and plate 2x2. Simple version. We don't have the interior cylinder or the recessed pegs. So the interior cylinder we're calling, when we add that, we're calling that intermediate. And then when we also have the cylinder and the interior recessed pegs, we're calling that the advanced brick. So here are our 2x2 simple brick and plate. And I'll give you a chance to perform that. In the next section of video, really just a review, we'll do a 2x4 brick and plate. All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Now that you've completed your 2x2 brick and plate, let's go ahead and export them, and we'll title them. So I've got this one selected in object mode. We'll come to File, Export Selection, and we can just call this 2x2 brick, and we'll type the MA when we're exporting, just to make sure that we've got that appropriately labeled. File type is my ASCII, and then when we export, we'll manually type in the .ma, and we'll hit Export Selection. We'll grab the plate, and we'll do the same thing, File, Export Selection, and we'll say 2x2, 2x2 plate, and we'll manually type .ma. File type is my ASCII, and we'll hit Export Selection. And then we can just create a new scene to begin our 2x4. We'll say File, New Scene. And we don't need to save this particular file. Good idea to have, but because we exported each piece of geometry, it's not necessary. So I'm going to say don't save. I'll bring back my grid, and this time let's import our peg start. So at the beginning of this video, we reviewed that, and if you wanted to build a peg from scratch right now, is a good that would be good review. But I'm going to import this, File, Import. There's our peg start. We'll hit Import, and I'm going to jump into the top view, and let's grid snap this down. And I'm going to use my keyboard command to duplicate, and we'll grid snap. So Command D, Command D. We're just grid snapping this. Command D. Oops, we'll grid snap this down. I missed the X and hit the D accidentally. And then we'll give ourselves two more on either side. So Command D, grid snap that up. Command D, grid snap this over. We'll select this one, Command D, grid snap it down. Command D, grid snap it over. And we've set it up this way just so that the middle our origin is at the middle. So when we create this, the new pivot will be sitting at the middle. You could have offset that and just manually change the pivot, but this gives us one less step. So we'll select all of these. We can take a look here. Whoops, right click to object mode. Let me reselect that. And we'll come to wireframe. I'll hit the Q key just because I was in the translate. We'll go to Q key, modeling toolkit, and we'll hit combine. So we'll got all all 8 selected as an object, and we'll hit combine. You'll recall if we hit the 3 key, we can see that the overlapping vertices did not weld or merge. I'll come back to 1. We'll right click, we'll grab it all, and we'll come to edit mesh merge, And now when we hit the 3 key, you can see that those have all been welded or merged. If you wanted to select one of the vertices and use your move tool, you can see that it's just a singular vertice. It's not two sitting on top of each other. Now, this is in the first section of the video where we duplicated this so that we could make a plate from this same starting point. And I'm reminded I've got lots of history here. So let's go ahead and delete all of our history. Edit, delete all by type history. That got rid of all those transform nodes. So those 8 transform nodes are now just this polycylinder 9. We'll come up and we can hit duplicate or Command D. We'll offset this. We'll just put it on a layer and hide that away, and then you can come back and create your plate. We'll grab our outer edge, and now when we get a brick this size, there's a couple of different methods. In an upcoming video, I'll show you what may be quicker. We could have used it on this 2x8. We'll use the same exact method just so that you understand, or for consistency's sake. But in upcoming lessons, I'll show you a little shortcut when we're making these great big long bricks that might save us or will save us a little bit of time. But we're going to hit extrude here. And this is on the Z. Our brick is negative 4.8. When you go to create your plate in a moment, that'll be negative 1.6. But here I'm going to just manually type in 4.8, negative 4.8. And this is the part that I was just referring to a moment ago. When we come up and we say fill hole, at this point we have to use the multi-cut to cut across all of these edges to make it quad. Before we duplicated, and once again I'll show you this in an upcoming video, we could have just cut across and then duplicated the entire shape. And when you're making the great big long bricks, that's probably a better approach. But I'll breeze through this. We'll click, drag, click, drag, click, drag, click, drag. And in fact, I think I'll speed this up. Okay, so we've got that. Took a moment, took less than a minute actually, but it's just a little bit cumbersome, and we'll take a different approach in an upcoming video. But for now, we'll use this same exact method that we've created all of our bricks with. And ideally, you have this method committed to memory after you've created what is now maybe 8 total bricks. And that's a good idea to commit this to memory. Then when you go to create any type of custom brick, you don't have to refer to the instructions. All right, we'll hit extrude, and right, our offset is 0.8. And then with those faces selected, we'll hit extrude again. And then if you were executing this on your plate, this would be negative 0.8. Here we're going negative 4, right? Negative 4. On your plate, that would be negative 0.8. And then here we'll hit the Q key, right click to object mode, and we'll go through this selection process. And so we're going 8, shift click 8 times around to get this top rectangle. Hit the 4 key so you can see that. And same process, shift double click, we've got the bottom rectangles. And then we need to do this 4 times on this interior recessed rectangle. We hit the 4 key, you can see there are the 4 rectangles. I'll dolly around so you can see that. If you miss it, you'll just have to undo or reopen. We'll come and we'll do the corners. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we'll do the diagonals. We'll do the interior corners, 2, 3, and 4. So we got the 4 rectangles and then all of our corners. I'll hit the 4 key and we'll dolly around that slowly so you can see. And if you miss it, just undo or reopen. We'll hit bevel, and you'll recall that the fraction is 0.2 and the segments are 2. And then I'm going to manually click on the select tool. We'll hit the 5 key, object mode 5 key, and there is our what we would call sub D0, no subdivisions. And you'll want to save this, as I mentioned, or export it. We could say File, Export Selection, and we would call this 2x4 sub D0. And we'll use this in some dynamic exercises. But for your brick builds, we would come to Mesh, Smooth, and this is the version that you will use in your brick builds when you're not seeing the bottom. We'll ultimately create the 3 cylinders and then the 8 interior peg recesses. But if you're stacking bricks, this is your go-to piece, just your simple 2x4. Now, I'm going to let you go ahead and create the plate. And the only thing to remember is that the Z length is negative 1.6, and then the interior recess is negative 0.8. So that is the only difference, and this will give you an opportunity to understand whether or not you've memorized this section. Of course, now go back and use your notes, and if you need to come back and rewatch the video, that's fine. But let's have you go ahead and create that plate on your own. All right, 2x2 brick and plate, 2x4 brick and plate, simple version, and see you in the next video. Have a good one.